Good afternoon, and I want to begin by thanking the Mitchell Center and its staff for arranging to host this first sustainability talk of the year. I really appreciate everyone's help here. It's a great organization at the Mitchell Center. Very grateful. Today's talk is also the inaugural event of the Art and Creative Ecologies series, a semester-long series of presentations and panels addressing the ways that art and creative practice intervene in ecological and social crises. And you can learn more about the series. I'm not going to promote the whole series right now. You can learn more about the series by visiting the Department of Art website. And there is a featured link there, Art and Creative Ecology series. You can see who we have scheduled, and there are still some things being arranged. The Art and Creative Ecology series is made possible by a seed grant from the University of Maine Arts Initiative, which is run out of the Vice President for Research's office. So grateful to the VPR for that. So no one is better suited to helping us understand the concept of creative ecologies than TJ Demos. And I'm delighted that he's able to join us here today in person. TJ is an art historian and cultural critic who writes on contemporary art and visual culture, particularly in relation to globalization, politics, migration, and ecology. He is professor in the Department of the History of Art and Visual Culture at UC Santa Cruz, and the founding director of the Center for Creative Ecologies, also at UC Santa Cruz. And he is the author of many articles and books. Several of the most influential books, at least in my mind, are Decolonizing Nature, Contemporary Art and the Politics of Ecology, The Migrant Image, The Art and Politics of Documentary During Global Crisis, and most recently, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it's most recently Beyond World's End, and Arts of Living at the Crossing. So please welcome TJ Demos for a talk titled Creative Ecologies and the Aesthetics of Climate Justice.
Thank you. Yeah. Hopefully this will work now. Okay, according to, so I'm going to come back to this. According to the environmental activists of Extinction Rebellion, or XR, we must decarbonize by 2025, otherwise we'll confront the death of our future. Their demand, based on recent science, stressing the limited time frame before the planet crosses irreversible tipping points leading to climate catastrophe, poses new imperatives, not just to political engagement, but also to scholarship unaccustomed to operating in post-Anthropocene emergency conditions, especially in the arts and humanities. Indeed, long-established humanities practices founded upon distanced observation and critical thinking and slow research are now threatened by activist temporality and its explicit ends-oriented politicization. If we care about the earth, there appears no alternative but to participate energetically. In the same way that many scientists, renowned in the past for their political neutrality, have recently come to push increasingly for policy shifts, even embracing direct action and getting arrested at protests where research and advocacy converge. As the leading climatologist and activist James Hansen, for instance, says, you can't be neutral on a moving train. Yet rather than abandon historical consciousness and critical thinking in the embrace of urgent climate response, we should commit to those very resources now more than ever, or so I'll argue. Far from outmoded, those resources are imperative in helping us determine future courses of action. This remains true politically, no less than art historically, in carefully considering, for instance, how aesthetic practices and media, including XRs, operate in the context of climate emergency, and how we might productively amplify and join those struggles. So we should first direct our critical analysis, in this case, toward XR's claims, scrutinizing how the group moves from abstract statistics related to, for instance, atmospheric carbon measured in parts per million, to arguing for urgent political action. As they write, unfortunately, because of years of delay and inaction, we have reached a crisis where we will only meet our carbon targets if we take urgent emergency action. Their definition of emergency rests largely on the basis of forward-looking climate modeling and coming environmental threats, from which follows their argument for the necessity of civil disobedience, to bypass corrupted governmental politics. For instance, shutting down roads, gluing themselves to buildings, performing funerals for the future. All are mediagenic direct actions designed to get government to declare and act upon climate emergency. But other activist groups, attuned to social justice frameworks of political analysis, however, insist on situating environmental breakdown within long histories of colonial oppression and land dispossession and the ongoing structural violence of extractivism and petrocapitalism. As the research and activism of environmental justice have taught us, these forces disproportionately impact frontline communities who have suffered decades and even centuries of socio-political, economic, and environmental inequalities. They are the ones, much more than the well-resourced, who are devastated by global warming and extreme weather events and have sustained years of exposure to toxicity and failing infrastructure and ecosystem breakdown, with options for adaptation or moving elsewhere, often lacking. For them, the rebellion against extinction is something altogether different than the above cited activist program directed at decarbonization. It's for this reason that aligned activist groups operating internationally under the name Wretched of the Earth, maybe that slide should come first, invoking Frantz Fanon's mid-20th century anti-colonial militancy, have been so forceful in their criticisms of Extinction Rebellion, refusing to view climate emergency solely in the future tense. Indeed, as they write of the current climate threat, this bleakness is not something of the future. For those of us who are indigenous, working class, Black, brown, queer, trans, or disabled, the experience of structural violence became part of our birthright. Greta Thunberg calls world leaders to act by reminding them that our house is on fire. But for many of us, the house has been on fire for a long time. Whenever the tide of ecological violence rises, our communities, especially in the global South, are always hit first. We are the first to face poor air quality, hunger, public health crises, drought, floods, and displacement. So remember the future. Climate emergency has, according to this reading, not emerged as the inadvertent consequence of industrial modernity, affecting all equally, right? Contrary to the prevailing opinion that we're all in this together. Rather, it has resulted from this perspective, from centuries of colonial pillage, violent environmental transformation, and genocidal destruction, creating and perpetuating profound systemic injustice. The result is one major divergence then in emergency politics between XR's decarbonization activism and Wretched of the Earth's social justice ecology, where we see clearly that environmentalism today represents a scene of profound disagreement. Rather than proposing a shared universal political horizon, environmentalism forms a rift zone of deep antagonism, with one's emergency threatening to erase another's, compounding oppression and making solidarity across difference ever precarious. In other words, there is more than one rebellion against extinction. As Wretched of the Earth point out, in order to envision a future in which we will all be liberated from the root causes of the climate crisis, capitalism, extractivism, racism, sexism, classism, ableism, and other systems of oppression, the climate movement must reflect the complex realities of everyone's lives in their narrative. Just how we understand climate emergency, and by extension, the Anthropocene's political geology, leads as well to radically different approaches to art, activism, and scholarship. With these above insights in mind, it becomes urgent in the wider context of emergency demands, in my view, to carefully consider these larger disagreements and their stakes, especially in assessing artistic practices that take on activist and interventionist dimensions. Instead of supporting apolitical neutrality, as with dominant strains of traditional scholarship, such critical analysis operates politically and by amplifying justice-based frameworks growing out of long histories of environmental justice movements that stress a complex socio-ecological understanding of climate breakdown. The imperative then is to break through superficial understandings of emergency that limit or our purview to near future impacts, and worse, fossil capitalist varieties completely detached from social justice priorities, and instead comprehend present conflicts in light of long histories of the intertwinement of social and ecological formations. This is just a range of some of the, I think, most interesting and compelling. For instance, let me turn to some artistic examples now. For instance, consider Adrian Lahoud's ongoing investigation of what he calls climate crimes, as in his 2018 video-based installation that maps the global circulation of aerosol emissions, drawing on data compiled by NASA. You can find much of this stuff online if you'd like to look into it more. The piece implicates the UN climate summits that have been going on for about 30 years now, and their abstract negotiation of future warming limits to a matter of 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, which in reality means that certain regions of the world will be heated to a much greater extent. So that's what he's pointing out, is this, the abstract statistics don't take into account the regionally specific impacts, which can vary greatly. So the recognition of such uneven warming, led by the Sudanese diplomat Lumumba Diaping, whom you see on the screen here, led him to accuse industrial regions of the global north, and by extension, UN climate negotiators, of practicing climate genocide in Africa, a position that informs Lahoud's project. Or take Arthur Jafa's 2016 video, Love is the Message is Death, a searing compilation of dash cam and cell phone recordings of police brutalizing African Americans, where climate becomes an expansive socio-ecological category of racial oppression, as much as of catastrophic environmental conditions. Indeed, one of the video's short passages shows a couple of figures struggling, you can see this on the top left, struggling through the floodwaters in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, an unnatural disaster precipitated by the convergence of extreme weather, racial inequality, and infrastructure breakdown, this particularly in Louisiana and New Orleans. A different but related approach is offered by forensic architecture based in London, which investigates cases of state and corporate violence visited upon colonized, disenfranchised, and militarily oppressed communities worldwide. Recent cases of theirs have included herbicidal warfare in Gaza from 2019. You see a couple stills from the website on that project. It documents Israel's use of glyphosate in border zones of this colonized area, where chemical weapons are deployed against vegetation in acts of settler atmospherics in order to secure Israeli lands. And their Project Triple Chaser from 2019, including a video that exposes the activities of the tear gas manufacturer that's actually called Safariland, and its CEO, Warren B. Kanders, leading to his, you see him on the bottom left image on the far right, leading to his being ousted from the board of trustees of the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York as the result of concerted social movement opposition to the cultural institutions' art washing, that's what it's called, of military profiteering, including the efforts of the collective decolonize this place. In this latter case, the spread of tear gas used to quell social uprisings all over the world, as shown in the video, defines the weaponization of the atmosphere via state and military securitization. Lastly, I know I'm going very fast here, but you get the idea. There's a lot more analysis we could bring to these works of art, but I'm just going fairly quickly through this. Consider the Autolith group's video Infinity Minus Infinity, an experimental film from 2019 that addresses geology from a distinctly politico-ecological perspective, wherein the crimes of racial capitalism, in their words, are intimately and materially linked to the violence of climate catastrophe. The film features a range of allegorical figures appearing as if a chorus of future truth tellers commenting on the horror of our climate deranged presence, who link colonization of the Americas to the initiation of the Anthropocene's environmental disaster. And we know if you research this further, that colonization led to the deaths of some approximately 50 million indigenous people. It led to the reforestation of the Amazon area. Consequently, there was massive carbon uptake. So there's actually a demonstrable evidence within the stratigraphic record in geology of this basically century-long or so genocide. Drawing on, and they deal with that in the film, I only have time to show you some stills. Drawing on the Black feminist poetics of the Brazilian philosopher Denise Ferreira da Silva, as much as also on Catherine Youssef's political geology, the film offers an audio-visual construction that situates anti-Black and anti-Indigenous extraction at the origin of the modern environment. What I'm interested in with these projects is how their diverse approaches to aesthetic practice all disarticulate and reconfigure terms like atmosphere, climate, and environment as more than abstract categories of non-human natures. Instead, they become insistently socio-ecological. In other words, dense entanglements of politics, economics, and technology, as much as also of biology, chemistry, and geology. This is not a simple matter of political perspective or of a social art history of association and metaphor that draws distinct fields of being together. Rather, these practices offer various approaches to what my colleague Donna Haraway calls sensible materialism, where past colonial and extractive violence provide ongoing and determining forces within social life today. Forces that play a palpable role in defining the present in ways that can't be forgotten, repressed, or separated out without enacting epistemic violence. As a site where aesthetics and environment cross in the same way that the Anthropocene identifies the irrevocable collision of human and natural history, sensible materialism opens the analysis of what I term intersectionalist ecology. As we write about in this book that I co-edited on contemporary art, visual culture, and climate change that came out last year. As well, it proposes a politics of justice, without which we're unable to come to terms with the past and are instead fated to be haunted by it, in the same way that Wretched of the Earth criticizes Extinction Rebellion. In her book, In the Wake, on Blackness and Being, Christina Sharp considers, quote, anti-Blackness as total climate, suggesting a like-minded phase shift in the conceptualization of climate emergency. She points to the infamous history of the 1781 Zong atrocity. Zong is being the ship that you may see here in the painting. When that British ship's captain opted to throw 130 enslaved people overboard and subsequently cash in on insurance claims after running low on drinking water on the open seas owing to navigational errors. In her discussion of the case, And that's represented possibly by Turner. They're not sure if that's the exact boat, but it gives you, I think, a approximation. In her discussion of this case, Sharp references the science of residence time, the period it takes a substance to enter and leave the ocean, which for human blood and sodium is about 260 million years. The Zong's past, in other words, is still present. For Black people, everything is now. It's all now, she explains, quoting Toni Morrison. Sharp's discussion provides a methodological lesson for environmental justice-based analysis. It constitutes a materialist forensic approach to environment and atmosphere that helps avoid the emergency thinking that would abandon history in the production of a future-oriented politics and a narrowing of environmentalism. So the challenge and the imperative for an environmental politics worthy of the name is bringing past emergencies into proximity with present ones, connecting them through their complex disjunctions and equally their continuities. In a similar vein to Sharp's discussion, we can return to the question of CO2 that Extinction Rebellion highlights and reflect on its composition in order to get beyond abstract statistics. Considering the residency time of CO2 in the atmosphere, research shows that between 65% and 80% of it eventually dissolves into the ocean over a period of 20 to 200 years, where it may then linger for millions. That means when we refer to actually existing atmospheric carbon, as is visualized in this piece by Jacqueline Brown, part of forensic architecture. So when we refer to the atmospheric carbon, the most common of greenhouse gases, we're referring to the culmination of 200 years of its production, consisting of not only generic industrial sources, but also all manner of past cases of environmental toxicity, warfare, human rights crimes, and social violence. That's circulating around the planet right now in terms of carbon in the atmosphere. The traces may not exactly be sensible in their specificity, but that's where experimental art becomes all the more urgent to provide methodologies for sensing differently. Everything is now, it's all now, as Christina Sharp says, and indeed, we continue to consume it to some degree with every breath. Of course, this is not to say that all air is the same or that everyone breathes pollution equally. We know that breathing spaces are racialized geographies, as long observed by environmental justice analysts, such as the crucial work of Robert Bullard. Vulnerable disenfranchised populations are situated disproportionately near toxic waste facilities, meaning that the act of breathing is inextricable from histories of structural racism, urban planning, and industrial and military waste where they converge. Not only are race and class inequalities experienced in elemental ways in relation to air, water, and soil, but generally speaking, and as Lindsay Dillon and Julie Z argue in a recent essay, they say Blacks and whites actually breathe different air. And I'm just throwing this up because this happens to be a current political demand by Black Lives Matter, the Breathe Act. It's explicitly environmental justice focused, considering breathing as a locus of political justice seeking. That's also the conclusion that Imani Jacqueline Brown raises in this piece that I just mentioned, which draws on a recent project for forensic architecture, which shows how cotton and sugar plantations in Louisiana, once part of the slave economy, have mutated into petrochemical industry plants in the afterlife of slavery, where toxic air is the ongoing effect of racial and environmental injustice, which African-American communities are fighting in the present. So the value of these art practices, and there's lots more, but these are the ones that I'm most interested in and compelled by these days, is that they demand a shift in the discourse, showing how analyses, activism, and artistic practices that focus their energies on generically conceived atmospheric carbon are inadequately narrow at best, repressive of histories of violence at worst. Critical storytelling, as much as forensic analysis and a new geological poetics, offers the opportunity for us, scholars, teachers, writers, students, activists, organizers, to collectively transform by sensing otherwise, becoming other than docile carbon subjects or colonial settlers, perpetrators of discriminatory violence, and competitive individuals of material wealth, which are the typical range of positions reinforced in dominant cultures of petrocapitalism. In this regard, intersectionalist ecology demands a corresponding activism of alliance building across identities of difference, starting from a disidentification from oppressive, dominant, hierarchical formations of white supremacy, liberalism, and anthropocentrism. This argument is not simply based on an ethics of subjective perspective or a leftism of privileged choice. It rather stems from acknowledging the practical necessity and indeed the emergency of building inclusive and diverse movements capable of challenging the divide and conquer tactics of the elite political class, the members of which, through their endless wars and fossil fuel economies, are laying waste to the world. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears. Hopefully you'll see how this is connected. So how can we scale up these kinds of research positions to a collective and an institutional level where they can mobilize greater collaborative thinking, social energy, and more expansive platforms than those typically available to individual scholarly projects? If climate justice policy requires necessary collective basis of diverse stakeholders, and I think it does, how can we challenge the individuated and competitive conventions of scholarship in cultivating a collectivist and democratic methodology? These are some of the motivations that led me to set up the Center for Creative Ecologies in 2015, when I moved from the University of London to University of California, Santa Cruz, in order to address these questions. Ever since, it's served as a platform to investigate art and cultural practices and their relation to such subjects as social justice, environmentalism, climate change as class war, ecology as intersectionality, climates of reparation, decolonial climates, as well as to reshape institutional cultures as much as we can, to carry out the research and diversify and collectivize our discussions. So let me tell you a little bit about our challenges and accomplishments briefly. Creating a center, this is one of our events dedicated to extraction a few years ago. It's offered a number of advantages. We can collectivize research concerns. We can displace our individual academic profiles in that collectivization. We can create a conversational context of interdisciplinarity, meaningful interdisciplinarity. This is a real challenge. Like basically every university internationally pays lip service to interdisciplinarity, but they rarely put their money where their mouths are and fund actual meaningful contexts and institute forms of interdisciplinarity, like giving course releases and allowing for collaborative research, actually. And this also provides a platform for research that possesses institutional legitimacy and can consequently enact disciplinary transformation. And that's actually important, especially in a field like art history that hasn't really been at the forefront of taking up environmental humanities concerns. Basically, a center can shift scholarly practice and discourse beyond individual forms, but it also has entailed confronting numerous institutional challenges in the university ecosystem of highly partitioned academic divisions and departments, with the administration often, as I just said, supporting interdisciplinarity, but not really meaningful ways. There's also the ongoing difficulty of getting substantial multi-year center funding that I face, as the majority of research funding tends to support still very much so individual research, while center funding, especially within the arts and humanities, doesn't really fall into university priorities or budgets or planning. Nonetheless, we've had some notable success in our CCE research projects since 2015, and I'd like to briefly discuss 3 of them. These have also informed and built upon my own research concerns, which I think you'll see as I go through these. First, there's our Mellon Sawyer Seminar project that took place over the last 3 years. Second, our contribution to the Manifesta Biennial exhibition in Europe in 2020. And third, my work with the Mott Climate Collective during 2021, forming an extension of the Center for Creative Ecologies commitments. So I'll just go quickly through these and describe them a little bit. You can find more information about them online. From 2019 to 21, I, along with the CCE, directed a 3-year Mellon-funded Sawyer seminar at UC Santa Cruz under the title Beyond the End of the World, which was conceptually framed in the following way. There is widespread consensus that we're living at the end of democracy, of liberalism, of capitalism, of a cool planet, of the Holocene, of civilization as we know it, and more. This kind of negativism and catastrophism is really rife these days, unfortunately, for good reason. Catastrophic climate breakdown, mass species extinction, financial collapse, global nuclear war, apocalyptic populism, racist and sexist divisions. The diagnoses are seemingly endless, prompting multiple questions. What hopes are there for survival? How can we imagine the unimaginable? Who is the collective we? And what will life look like beyond the many ends portrayed in pop culture, dystopian sci-fi, political commentary, indigenous worldviews, and post-anthropocentric philosophies, as well as climate science? Addressing this urgent, multifarious, and world historical subject, one that centers interlinked sociopolitical, economic, and environmental crises. The seminar invited some of the world's leading speculative thinkers and cultural practitioners to UC Santa Cruz to deliver public lectures considering such questions. And these punctuated an expansive research project that included 2 art exhibitions, in addition to a film screening series and coordinated postdoctoral and PhD level scholarships. For instance, we had keynote presentations by Keeanga Yamada Taylor, author of the book From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. There was Amitav Ghosh, the Indian-American fiction writer and author of the book The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable. The political theorist Jody Dean, author of the book Comrade and co-author of the recent essay Climate, Leninism and Revolutionary Transition. Nick Estes, author of Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline, and a long tradition of indigenous resistance. And Melanie Yazzie, co-editor of Decolonization, Indigeneity, Education, and Society. Both are co-founders of the indigenous movement called the Red Nation, based in Albuquerque. And we also had artist activists Amin Hussein and Natasha Dillon of the New York-based collective Decolonize This Place, and also Rashida Phillips and Kime Ayewa of Black Quantum Futurism, the collective, which is based in Philadelphia, dedicated to speculative thought and creative practice at the nexus of Afrofuturism, racial justice, and space agency. And then recordings of these presentations are available on our website. It began in person, and then the pandemic struck, so it really felt like we dedicated this research project to beyond the end of the world. It seemed like the world was ending in the very moment when we were doing this. And maybe it is. Maybe that's what we're witnessing, the slow death of our world. There was also an art exhibition, Beyond the World's End, a group show featuring 10 artists and collectives presenting artworks variously imagining emancipatory futurity at the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History. And also this exhibition at the University Gallery dedicated to Just Futures with the groups Black Quantum Futurism, also Arthur Jaffa and Martine Sims, which presented a selection of artists building on the history of Afrofuturisms and inventing new artistic proposals for anti-racist temporality and socially just representation today. Overall, the project was, I think, an enormous learning experience, confirming our initial hypothesis that emergency politics has deep roots in colonial and racial capitalism. And for many communities, the apocalypse is not in the future, but in the deep past. If you look at indigenous thinkers like Kyle Powys White, for instance, he says this explicitly. So the challenge, again, is to connect these different emergencies in struggling against ongoing future threats. So that was part of my motivation personally for doing this. Is I think we face a kind of negativity, a nihilism, or catastrophism that can very well be debilitating. And in my classes and experiences of teaching, I find this within my students, in the student body these days. I would argue we can't surrender to this negativity. We have to we can only come up with ways of approaching it, addressing it, and cultivating hope. Hope as a discipline, hope as a social practice. I think we can't do anything else, or else it's profoundly debilitating. Thanks to our growing visibility of the center, we were invited to participate in Manifesto. This is the European Biennial Art Exhibition that was meeting in that year, 2020, in Marseille, France. This is a pretty big exhibition. You may not have heard about it, but in the European context, it's quite a leading mega exhibition of international contemporary art practices. We presented the exhibition called War Ecologies with Isabel Carbonell, who's at the time was a dissertation fellow of the center, and Hannah Mazaros Martin, a center postdoc. Unfortunately, none of us in the end could attend the exhibition owing to the pandemic, but it still went ahead. You can see one of the installation views here. And we described the exhibition research concerns as follows. War ecologies call forth not just mutuality, but collapse, survival within violence. Conflict involves corporate extraction and militarized assaults on environments and environmentalists, while multi-species life and coexistence are under grave threat. In its curatorial presentation, the center offers two artistic case studies asking what kind of pluriverse is possible in the face of different kinds of socio-ecological violence. The first study addresses the criminalization of non-human life in Putumayo, southern Colombia, by Hannah Mazaros Martin. The other considers sci-fi surrealism and extinction in the Mar Menor, which is a saltwater lagoon in southeastern Spain, by Isabel Carbonell. These comprise part of the center's ongoing research project Beyond the End of the World, searching out spaces of hope emerging from geographies of despair. War Ecologies identifies not only neoliberal enterprise using climate breakdown to introduce authoritarian politics, but also struggles, human and more than human, for ways to transcend the forces of socio-economic inequality and political environmental calamity. With Manifesto, the CCE was able to support the work of affiliated graduate students, including their own transnational collectivized research concerns. The last project I'll briefly discuss is my work with the Climate Collective. And the year-long program last year it organized, which was called Climate Emergency 2 Emergence. While the project was not hosted by the CCE, for me, it connected to its collective project, as well as to the shared research concerns of the other members of the international and interdisciplinary climate collective I invited to join in, including the South Africa-based Mulema Moiloa, London-based Susan Shupley, and Brazil-based Paulo Tavares. This was all at the invitation of Lisbon's Museum of Art and Technology, or MAT, for which the Climate Collective came up with this statement. So they basically invited me to put together something. I didn't want to act alone, so I formed a collective. This is the program that we came up with. Bringing urgent focus, and I think again you'll recognize the concerns here. Bringing urgent focus to climate emergency, MAT's Climate Collective energizes critical analyses and creative proposals in moving beyond catastrophism and toward the emergence of environmentally sustainable and socially just futures. Rather than viewing climate emergency as uniquely situated in the not yet, we insist on connecting present anxieties over climate breakdown to long histories of socio-environmental violence, colonial extractivism, and racial capitalism. Our analytic widens the scope of emergency beyond the narrow focus on atmospheric carbon, expanding into complex entanglements of socio-political and techno-economic climates within and beyond the human, enlivening a public arena of collective debate. Climate emergency to emergence asks, how can we move from climate emergency or the catastrophe of Earth system breakdown as much as failed sociopolitical arrangements to climate emergence, generating new forms of life founded upon social justice and environmental well-being. Integral to our initiative will be to explore, or was to explore, how and why socio-environmental approaches that foreground social justice, decolonial thinking, and critiques of racial capitalism matter to climate policy. Our programming was organized around monthly discussions with theorists and practitioners of contemporary art and climate justice, including a session on climate reparations with Olufemi Taiwo, who you see here on the bottom left, a discussion of the anti-racist imperatives of climate justice with Ashish Galandi of the group I mentioned earlier, Wretched of the Earth, and Penny Wangari Jones of Racial Justice Network, UK, a conversation on ecologies of repair with Imani Jacqueline Brown, whose project Environmental Violence in Death Alley, Louisiana, represents a recent, as I mentioned, a recent forensic architecture investigation, and a session on Carolina Caicedo's anti-extractivist videos and social practices largely centered on Colombia's Amazon, and a discussion about the artistic tribunal of Jonas Stahl and Rada de Souza, held in 2021, entitled Court for Intergenerational Climate Crimes. It's really an amazing project. You can find more information online. These many conversations, including the contributions of my climate collective colleagues and our guests, have helped refine and reconfigure my own understanding of climate emergency, especially as defined through the social justice and anti-colonial perspectives of the artists with whom we engaged. Those lessons are also reflected and further developed, at least for me, in my own work, as reflected, for instance, in recent book projects of mine. All of these projects, the Mellon series Beyond the End of the World, our Manifesta contribution, and climate collective work, demonstrate the goals of the Center for Creative Ecologies then, to generate collectivity, model ecology as relationality. It poses critical questions about related to contemporary emergency. It does so in an ever-threatening environment of climate threat, political fragmentation, and institutional austerity. Indeed, the CCE runs counter to dominant political economy, which operates in general in the service of neoliberalism, including in the university and more broadly in global climate governance, which reflects the interests of fossil capital. But that critical resistance makes the center's mission, in my view, difficult, but ever more urgent. Finally, of course, these projects are in the end but modest contributions to rethinking the climate emergency crisis, amplifying more comprehensive and politically compelling artistic and activist practices, and building methodologies of collective practice that must be scaled up. There remains enormous work to be done if we're to build the majoritarian political movement to challenge the domination of fossil capitalist governance. For that, we must organize and build capacity. My work with the CCE is one step in that direction. All right, thank you.
Terrific. Everyone, can we give another round of applause for this wonderful talk that is helping us think about a lot of different things that are very important. we had a chance here to hear about the Center for Creative Ecologies and and the exciting work that's going on there. If you had to say one sentence, TJ, about the challenges and accomplishments, what would you say? I know that's unfair, but a quickie.
Yeah, the challenge is basically, if you can imagine taking on a second job on top of an already full-time professorship. That represents the challenges, and the accomplishments are too few. But I'm really happy with the kind of relationships that we've formed and the building of a small, but as you saw, international movement of shared thinking about the climate emergency that we're in.
One of the things that people are thinking about, as you mentioned, it's so hard to change universities. So if you had short advice for everybody here about what are 2 or 3 steps so that your center isn't the only one like this, important as it is, but that other campuses could really be thinking about this.
I think we need a sea change in terms of how we think about education. We have to move away from neoliberalism and publicly fund education at all levels, and realize that it's a common resource and part of our heritage as a civilization. So it's not about establishing more, competitive or individual-led centers. It's ultimately about how can we cultivate a sense of shared responsibility, accountability, and well-being for all of us, including at the university level. That means, I think, rebuilding universities, because they've been so corrupted by private funding imperatives and public withdrawal of resources. So how we do that, the universities are a site of struggle. And we can't have conversations ultimately. I think this is very much my personal view. We can't just have conversations with administration and convince them of this. It's going to take labor struggles, unionization, I think, and striking. Another
related question. So college students are in so many different majors. If students from different majors came to your center and wanted to be involved, how would you involve them? How would you bring them together?
That's kind of what I'm doing these days, is moving away from my own individual directed programming of the center, which I needed to do because I started it up after all, and moving toward student project supported research, actually. So if students came and wanted to get involved, I would turn back the question on them, but not in a challenging way, but I would want to try to help them direct their energy so that it could be productive and generative.
Terrific.
So that the center could be a platform to support student research. Ultimately, that's the goal. Ultimately.
One person said, land grant institutions like UMaine have access to land. Do you know of work around improving how students and others can have access to that land, and how it might be linked to the work, say, that you're doing?
Not offhand, although I know that's a really thorny question and inevitably has to involve indigenous views and leadership, actually. So I would think that the first step is to realize that we're all on stolen land, and we have to have important, difficult, challenging conversations with indigenous folks who should be involved in these conversations and also in leadership positions.
Great. Thinking about child artists. So let's say a whole group of 4 and 5 and 6-year-olds come to your center. How are you involving them, or how would you? How are you changing art?
We haven't really done that, actually. But I've in my presentation, you can tell I'm focusing on a certain kind of art that I think is important. I like to write about it, but I would never put myself in the position of saying this is the stuff that everyone should look at and that's it. There's nothing else. I think, I'm increasingly agreeing with Joseph Beuys. Everyone is an artist. Everyone should be an artist. Everyone is, creativity is fundamental to being human. Certainly for kids, this is, I think, incredibly important. It comes back to education as well. Why would we be cutting arts programming for children instead of seeking to reinforce it and to resource it and put it into conversation with other subjects of education? I think that would be really important. We don't work with young kids in the center, but if we did, I think we would come up with programming like that supports a child. I would like to see a child-driven, even child-led kind of workshop. Certainly nothing that I would teach. I would like to learn from 6-year-olds.
Yeah, wouldn't we all? It'd be really.
I say that I have 2 kids, and I've learned a tremendous amount for them. But it's easy to say, but that has not been. It's more difficult to practice. But I try.
How are you working to show that art can make a difference? How's your center doing that, or art or music, or how as program evaluators might come to you and say, okay, how do we know this is making a difference, what you're doing?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. It's kind of like, it calls for a sociological methodology of analysis of impacts, basically. And that's something that I've also resisted, because ultimately there are no clear measurable impacts, even though there are examples, like forensic architecture is a great example of clear measurable impacts when they hold states or corporations to account, and they contribute to and help win lawsuits against these states and corporations. Those are definitely measurable impacts that are reversing real forms of social and environmental violence. But I also believe that art there's an immeasurable value, including in relationship to its impacts. I mean, we're still discovering stuff in terms of human civilizational deep meaning, in terms of artwork that's been around for centuries. I think our art ultimately is a site of infinity, and the impacts cannot be reduced to a bureaucratic calculation. They open up worlds, and we're still discovering, and many of us want to live in those worlds, and it gives life to people in ways that can't ultimately be reduced to a sociological value. So I realize that's important at the same time, but it's extremely complex the more you think about it.
Yeah, no, very, very important. One last from the audience that's not in the room with you is, one person says, I'm interested in forests and multiple impacts of climate change. Also, I'm a photographer wanting to open up the deeper picture that's buried behind data. What are your thoughts about how I can begin to incorporate photographic art into the chaos to illuminate what's at stake for forests?
I would say, that sounds good to me. Do the work, put it out there. And again, I try not to put myself in the position of, encouraging people to do this or that. But I'm happy to, when I come across stuff that I like, I'm happy to put a lot of energy into reading it and making meaning out of it. But I think, there's one really great piece that I like a lot called Forest Law. It's by the Swiss video artist Ursula Biemann and the guy that was part of the climate collective, Paulo Tavares. It's really an amazing piece. It's more video, it's less photographic, but it's an example, Forest Law, that is collaborative with indigenous groups in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And it's really fascinating in terms of what art potentially has to offer in thinking with and being with forests.
Wonderful, wonderful. David, are there some questions in the room? I know I've used up most of our time, in part because people are so interested in what you've had to say, TJ.
Thank you.
Linda, this has been wonderful to kind of see you bring together those kinds of questions. I've got a bunch for myself, and it's possible that there are people here who do too, but we are effectively at time. So if there's people in the room who have things they'd like to do, I'd encourage you to hang around for just a little bit. Maybe we can borrow a little bit more time from TJ.
Great.
And for now, let's thank him again for a wonderful.
Yes, thank you.